What if I told you that a drug most famous for, like, expanding your mind, was originally used by doctors for the exact opposite reason? I mean, specifically to make you lose your mind.
Yeah, it definitely shatters that culturally ingrained image we have, of what psychedelics are supposed to do.
Right.
When we think of these substances, we tend to think of Enlightenment or the 1960s counterculture. But the idea of psychiatrists using them to intentionally induce temporary madness in people is, well, it's usually just left out of the history books entirely.
It totally is.
Yeah.
And that paradox is entirely why we are doing this deep dive today. So we're looking at a really fascinating piece by Justin Garson in Psychology Today called The Secret History of LSD in Psychiatry.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, this completely blew my mind because it turns out our entire modern understanding of mental health, like the way we view our own brains, the chemical imbalance theories, even the pills sitting in your medicine cabinet right now,
Yeah.
all of it comes from doctors in the mid-20th century trying to manufacture madness in a lab.
It is a profound shift in perspective for anyone listening to this because, we tend to think of modern psychiatry as this very clean, linear progression of scientific discoveries.
Oh, absolutely. Like very sterile and organized.
Exactly. But the origin story is incredibly messy. I mean, it involves a strange mix of Hollywood elites, government intelligence agencies, and, believe it or not, radioactive monkeys.
Radioactive monkeys. I love that we're going there.
Yeah. And you really just can't understand how we treat mental illness today without understanding these bizarre experiments from, 70 years ago.
Okay, let's unpack this. We're going to take you through all of that. But to understand the secret history, we first have to ground ourselves in the side of psychedelic history that most people are actually familiar with.
Right. The more mainstream narrative.
Exactly. So if we rewind to the 1950s and the early 1960s, psychiatrists were enthusiastically giving LSD and mescaline to patients to heal them. And they were treating heavy clinical issues, severe depression, crippling anxiety, and chronic alcoholism.
Yeah. The clinical intention back then was very specific. The psychiatrists believed that if they could facilitate a really powerful, transcendent spiritual experience, that experience itself would act as a psychological reset button.
Like a hard reboot for the brain.
Basically, yeah. The theory was that a profound spiritual awakening would produce lasting, positive behavioral change. And what's fascinating is just how mainstream this was.
Right.
I mean, we aren't talking about a fringe underground movement here.
No, it was practically a trend in certain circles.
Absolutely. The source details some incredibly famous people who were vocal champions of this treatment at the time.
Yeah.
You had massive Hollywood stars, like Cary Grant, for instance.
Wow, Cary Grant.
Yeah. He underwent dozens of LSD therapy sessions and literally claimed it completely cured his deep-seated psychological traumas.
That is wild.
And you had the acclaimed writer Anais Nin advocating for it. Even Bill W., the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, he believed LSD could replicate the spiritual awakening necessary to help severe alcoholics get sober.
Which totally makes sense when you look at the modern psychedelic renaissance happening right now. A lot of today's therapists see themselves as picking up the torch from that specific 1950s healing tradition.
Right, they see it as a continuation.
So Garson's article pivots hard here.
Yeah.
Because at the exact same time that Cary Grant is having these, beautiful healing epiphanies, other psychiatrists were using LSD on healthy volunteers to deliberately induce severe mental illness.
Yes. The exact opposite goal.
Right. And wait, hold on. As someone listening, you have to wonder, how could the medical establishment look at the exact same chemical, the exact same era, and see both a spiritual miracle cure and a literal weapon of madness?
Well, it really comes down to the clinical gaze. Doctors in the 1950s were sitting in rooms with people on really high doses of LSD, carefully watching their behavior, and they noticed a profound, undeniable similarity.
Between the trip and something else?
Yeah, between an LSD trip and the acute psychosis associated with schizophrenia.
Oh, wow. So it wasn't just like a generic state of being intoxicated.
Yeah.
It's specifically mapped onto schizophrenia.
Correct. When psychiatrists observed a patient suffering from a severe schizophrenic episode, and then they observed a healthy individual peaking on an intense LSD trip, the outward manifestations were strikingly similar.
Okay, in what way exactly?
In both states, the doctor saw a radical break with reality. They observed severe auditory and visual hallucinations. They documented deeply held, bizarre delusions and disorganized, fragmented speech.
Jeez.
So, to the observer with a clipboard, the two states were nearly indistinguishable.
Okay, so if you are a doctor in the 1950s trying to solve the mystery of schizophrenia, which was this total black box of a disease at the time, and you suddenly realize you have a chemical in a vial that causes the exact same symptoms,
Yeah.
you are definitely going to wonder if the biological mechanism is the same.
And that was the massive leap in logic right there. The idea was, well, if we can reliably manufacture the symptoms of schizophrenia on demand using LSD, then figuring out exactly what LSD does to the physical brain might just reveal the biological root of the disease itself.
Right.
They were essentially trying to bottle schizophrenia in a laboratory setting so they could study it under a microscope.
And in 1954, they actually thought they found the smoking gun.
Yes, they did.
Two different research groups proposed what they call the serotonin hypothesis of schizophrenia. Basically, their early kind of rudimentary experiments with LSD suggested that the drug reduced the levels of serotonin in the brain.
And we should probably clarify what serotonin is for a moment, just because we hear the word all the time.
Good idea.
So serotonin is a neurotransmitter, which is essentially a chemical messenger. You can think of neurotransmitters like physical keys, and the receptors on your brain cells are the locks.
Okay, keys and locks. Makes sense.
Right. So when serotonin gets released, it floats across the gap between cells, slides into its specific lock, and sends a signal that regulates things like mood, perception, and cognition.
But these researchers in 1954 saw that when they introduced LSD, serotonin levels seemed to drop. So they made a massive sweeping guess. They guessed that schizophrenia itself must just be a natural serotonin deficiency.
It was an incredibly neat, logical deduction. I mean, based on the very limited tools they possessed back then. The syllogism was simple. LSD mimics schizophrenia. LSD lowers serotonin. Therefore, schizophrenia is caused by low serotonin.
But that logic is totally flawed. So it's like noticing your phone screen goes black when the battery dies and assuming every single black screen you ever encounter means a dead battery, even if the phone is just turned off.
Oh, that is a brilliant way to frame the fallacy. Yeah.
I mean, the screen could be smashed, the motherboard could be fried. They saw one correlation and jumped straight to the most obvious, simplest conclusion.
Exactly. They were looking at a symptom and assuming a singular cause. But the thing is, they were so confident in this theory that they started pushing the boundaries of medical research to prove it. Doctors began actively recruiting healthy volunteers and administering heavy doses of LSD and other psychotomimetics, which, by the way, literally translates to psychosis mimicking drugs.
Wow.
Yeah, they did this just to induce and study this schizophrenic state.
And the people they recruited.
Yeah.
The article mentions psychiatrist Leo Hollister, who was a major figure in this research. He famously administered LSD to volunteers at a veterans hospital.
He did, yeah.
And one of those random volunteers happened to be a young guy named Ken Kesey.
Which is crazy. And for anyone listening who is a fan of American literature, that name should definitely ring a bell.
Oh, absolutely.
That specific psychiatric experiment, which was intended to induce temporary madness, profoundly altered Ken Kesey's worldview. It actually directly inspired him to write the classic novel One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
That is just incredible.
Right. And that book completely revolutionized how the public viewed psychiatric institutions.
It's just wild to think a literal literary masterpiece was accidentally birthed from a lab experiment trying to prove a faulty serotonin theory.
It really is.
But, the article also touches on the fact that this wasn't all just innocent academic curiosity. There were military interests involved, too.
Yes. The historical context of the Cold War is definitely unavoidable here. Some of this research likely intersected with the CIA's top-secret MKUltra program.
Right, the mind control stuff.
Exactly. The intelligence community was heavily invested in exploring whether LSD could be utilized as a truth serum for interrogations, or even as a psychological weapon to break down enemy agents.
It is so dark.
It is. Now, to be clear, the author of our source impartially notes that while it has been claimed by some that researchers like Leo Hollister received CIA funding, the author couldn't independently verify that paper trail.
Okay, fair enough.
But still, the overlap between psychiatric researchers wanting to induce psychosis and military intelligence wanting to control the human mind, that was just a defining feature of the era.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the real issue with the serotonin hypothesis, whether it was funded by the CIA or university, was that they were still just guessing.
Yeah, they couldn't prove it.
Right. They knew LSD caused psychosis, but they couldn't actually see what the molecule was doing inside the dark machinery of the human brain. They needed a way to map it. And that brings us to Solomon Snyder.
Yes. Solomon Snyder is the pivotal figure in this entire narrative. In the early 1960s, Snyder was a young, brilliant neuroscientist and psychiatrist at Johns Hopkins University. And he had a very personal stake in this research.
Which I found so fascinating.
Right, because during his medical residency, Snyder actually took an LSD trip himself.
Yeah, the article details his experience, and it just sounds intense. He described this profound temporal distortion, like time just slowed down to an absolute crawl. But more significantly, he said his very self, like his entire ego and identity, felt like it was evaporating.
And, the evaporation of the self is a terrifying neurological concept. The brain has networks dedicated to maintaining your sense of you, your autobiographical memory, your physical boundaries.
And he felt all that slipping away.
Snyder felt those networks completely dissolving. And because he was a psychiatrist, that deeply personal, frightening experience fueled a professional obsession. He walked away from that trip wondering, is this terrifying evaporation of self exactly what my schizophrenic patients are experiencing every single day?
So he was highly, highly motivated to find the biological mechanism. But Snyder didn't actually believe the prevailing theory. He thought the idea that schizophrenia was just a serotonin depletion was entirely wrong.
Yeah, he spotted the massive flaw in the 1954 hypothesis. Snyder pointed out that there were several other pharmacological drugs on the market that aggressively depleted serotonin in the brain. But they didn't cause people to hallucinate or lose their sense of self. They didn't cause psychedelic trips at all. So, biologically speaking, simply emptying the brain of serotonin cannot be the sole trigger for psychosis.
Right. And just to pause for a second, because I know people listening might be wondering what LSD actually does.
Oh, sure.
The article points out that modern science proved Snyder's skepticism was totally justified. We know today that LSD doesn't deplete serotonin. It actually acts as a master key. It jams itself into a very specific serotonin receptor, the 5-HT2A receptor, and activates it, basically leaving the door wide open.
Yes, it excites the receptor.
Exactly. But Snyder didn't know that yet. He just knew the old theory was broken, so he went to some extreme lengths to figure out the truth.
Extreme is definitely the right word. Because he couldn't just, look at a living human brain in the 1960s. Snyder had to get creative. He took molecules of LSD and chemically tagged them with radioactive isotopes.
Which sounds like sci-fi.
Totally. Then he injected this radioactive LSD into monkeys. After the drug took effect, he would euthanize the monkeys, dissect their brains, and use a centrifuge to physically track where the radiation had concentrated.
I mean, he's literally using radiation as a glowing map to see which exact receptors the LSD keys were fitting into.
Exactly that. He was trying to map the physical architecture of psychosis. He even went as far as building complex mathematical models to simulate how the three-dimensional molecular structure of LSD interacted with brain cells.
He was seriously dedicated.
He was relentless. He even took another highly potent experimental psychedelic called STP and gave it to his own students at Johns Hopkins just to observe if it would induce a psychotic state.
Wait, testing military-grade hallucinogens on your own grad students.
Yeah, it really highlights how much of a Wild West scientific research was back then.
For sure.
But right as Snyder is doing this groundbreaking mapping, well, the culture outside his laboratory walls explodes. By 1966, LSD is no longer just a clinical tool. It has completely escaped the lab and become the absolute cornerstone of the youth counterculture.
And the U.S. government reacted with heavy, immediate restrictions. They cracked down on the possession and distribution of LSD, and virtually overnight, the regulatory hurdles became insurmountable for scientists.
Yeah, everything just stopped.
Snyder's research, like his primary tool for decoding mental illness, was effectively banned.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Snyder hits a total brick wall.
Right, like put yourself in his shoes. You were on the verge of mapping the biological roots of schizophrenia, and the government takes away the one chemical that lets you observe it. Most people would have their careers ruined.
Absolutely.
But Snyder does something brilliant. He realizes he doesn't necessarily need LSD. He just needs something legal that also causes psychosis.
And that realization forced one of the most consequential pivots in medical history. Snyder turned his attention away from psychedelics and he looked at what was happening on the streets. By the late 1960s, the United States was in the grip of a massive amphetamine epidemic.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, speed freaks, as they were called back then, were taking massive, prolonged doses of amphetamines.
And the result of taking all that speed wasn't just like a ton of energy. They were developing profound paranoid psychosis.
Exactly. The psychiatric symptoms were so severe, and they so perfectly mirrored paranoid schizophrenia, that many of these individuals showing up in emergency rooms were genuinely misdiagnosed by seasoned doctors.
Like they couldn't tell the difference.
No, the states were clinically indistinguishable. Some researchers even started giving amphetamines to volunteers intentionally, returning to that old strategy of manufacturing madness to study it.
And this is the pivot that changes everything. Because in 1970, Snyder studies these amphetamines, and he proves that they cause psychosis by flooding the brain with a completely different chemical, not serotonin, but dopamine.
And to understand why this is so huge, we need to understand what dopamine actually does. People often call it the pleasure chemical, but it's really about salience and motivation.
Okay, what does that mean?
Dopamine tells your brain, hey, pay attention to this. This is important for your survival. So when amphetamines flood the brain with dopamine, suddenly everything feels intensely significant.
Right, right.
The hum of a refrigerator sounds like a coded message. A random car driving by feels like a targeted surveillance operation.
So the brain is basically drowning in signals of profound importance, which creates the delusions and the paranoia.
Exactly.
And by proving that amphetamines caused this specific dopamine flood, Snyder birthed the dopamine hypothesis of schizophrenia. The theory that the disease itself is caused by an abnormally hyperactive dopamine system.
What's fascinating here is that the impact of that single discovery just cannot be overstated. By presenting hard biological evidence that a major mental disorder could be linked directly to an abnormality with a specific neurotransmitter, Snyder ushered the entire field of psychiatry into the modern age.
This is the exact moment the chemical imbalance theory is born. Like, it cemented this idea that we all just inherently accept today. The concept that mental disorders are fundamentally biological brain diseases.
Yes.
They aren't moral failings, they aren't demonic possessions, and they aren't just the result of bad parenting, which were all prevalent theories before this.
Very true.
They are chemical imbalances that can be managed with a pill.
It was a monumental paradigm shift. It transitioned psychiatry away from hours of Freudian psychoanalysis and talk therapy on a couch and moved it firmly into the realm of hard medical science, focused on neurochemistry and pharmacology.
It's wild to think about the historical accident of all this. Like, if the 1960s counterculture hadn't embraced LSD, the government wouldn't have banned it.
Yep.
And if LSD was never banned, Snyder might have just spent his entire career studying serotonin receptors. Psychiatry might look completely different.
Really might.
But because of that ban, he pivoted to amphetamines, and we got the dopamine hypothesis. We got the modern chemical imbalance theory. But, and this is a big but, as compelling as that narrative is, we have to look at the reality of the last 50 years. Has this neurochemical approach actually cured us?
Well, that brings us to the very complicated, somewhat sobering reality of modern psychiatry. The hard truth is that Snyder's vision, the idea that mental illness is simply a straightforward chemical imbalance that can be perfectly corrected with the right molecule, it just hasn't been nearly as successful as the medical community hoped back in 1970.
Wait, hold on. If we look at something like depression, millions of people right now are taking SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, to specifically boost their serotonin levels. Right.
We
see the commercials we hear in pop culture. The idea that depression is a lack of serotonin is treated as absolute biological fact. Are you telling me that's based on a flawed assumption?
I mean, it is widely accepted by the general public, yes. But the source material clarifies a very critical point here. Despite the immense cultural dominance of the serotonin theory of depression, there is actually remarkably little direct biological evidence that depression fundamentally stems from a serotonin deficiency.
Oh, wow.
The brain is vastly more complicated than a simple hydraulic system where you just top off low fluid levels.
So the thing we view as established science is actually highly contested. And if we bring it back to schizophrenia, the disease Snyder was trying to cure with his amphetamine pivot, did the dopamine theory actually solve the puzzle?
Unfortunately, no. In fact, over the last 40 years, the biological puzzle of schizophrenia has only deepened.
Really?
Yeah. For example, in the 1980s, pharmaceutical companies developed a new generation of antipsychotic drugs, medications like clozapine.
Did clozapine target the dopamine flood?
It did, but it also targeted a much wider range of neurotransmitter receptors, including serotonin. And ironically, clozapine was highly effective for many patients, even though it blocked dopamine less aggressively than the older drugs.
Interesting.
That clinical success basically proved that dopamine could not be the sole culprit. The mechanism of psychosis was much broader and much more complex.
We were only looking at the surface of the machinery. And the article mentions that today, some researchers have pivoted entirely away from dopamine. They believe a completely different chemical, glutamate, is the actual core issue.
And glutamate is fascinating. Unlike dopamine, which, as we said, modulates how much attention you pay to things, glutamate is the brain's primary excitatory neurotransmitter.
Excitatory meaning what?
It's essentially the main engine of brain activity, whereas dopamine is more like the steering wheel. Many researchers now theorize that a dysfunction in the glutamate system is the foundational problem in schizophrenia.
Oh, I see.
And the hyperactive dopamine that Snyder observed was just a downstream side effect of that broken engine.
Okay, so going back to our earlier analogy, dopamine was just the black screen on the phone. But glutamate is the actual fried motherboard causing the crash.
Yes, perfect comparison.
We keep finding out we are only treating the downstream symptoms. And it's not even just about the chemicals anymore, is it?
Not at all. The strictly biological chemical imbalance model often ignores the profound impact of lived experience.
Right.
The source emphasizes that environmental factors play a massive role in mental illness. We now have really robust data showing that adverse childhood experiences, things like severe trauma, neglect, chronic stress, they greatly increase the likelihood of a person developing adult psychosis.
Because trauma literally changes the brain, right?
Exactly. Trauma can literally alter the physical architecture and the synaptic pruning of a developing brain. You simply cannot separate the neurochemistry from the human environment.
So what does this all mean? We started this journey with mid-century Hollywood stars seeking spiritual enlightenment, detoured through radioactive monkeys and government bans, and we end up realizing that the neat, sterile boxes we try to put mental health into today might be fundamentally incomplete.
If there is one core takeaway from all of this for you listening, it is that understanding this secret history is just vital. It reveals that the chemical imbalance theory isn't some immutable law of nature that was handed down fully formed.
Right.
It was born from a very specific, strange, and chaotic series of historical events and drug bans in the 1950s and 60s. It was brilliant doctors doing the absolute best they could, but they were severely limited by the tools they were legally allowed to use.
And knowing that history forces us to demand a much more expansive picture of mental illness today, we have to look far beyond just mapping neurotransmitters and matching them to pills. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
We want to leave you with one final provocative thought to ponder on your own. Think about the fact that Solomon Snyder and the entire psychiatric establishment pivoted to dopamine only because the government suddenly banned LSD.
Right.
If that ban had never occurred, what alternative, possibly much more profound understanding of the human brain might we have discovered over the last 50 years? And looking at the world today, what other massive medical breakthroughs might we currently be missing simply because the necessary scientific tools are deemed socially taboo? Something to think about. See you next time.